553, Chapter 27, Survey of British Policies in India. Administrative policies contrary to their pre-1857 intentions of trying to modernize India on progressive lines. Now the administration adopted blatantly reactionary policies on the pretext that Indians were not fit for self-governance and needed British presence in their lives. Divide and rule. Determined to avoid a united mass action challenging their authority, the British rulers in India decided to practice an active policy of divide and rule by putting princes against states, people, region against region, province against province, caste against caste, and Hindus against Muslims. After an immediate spell of repression against Muslims, following the 1857 revolt, the authorities decided, after 1870, to use the middle and upper educated classes among Muslims against the rising tide of nationalism, using conflicts over scarce resources in education, administrative jobs, and later political spoils, which were inherent in the very logic of colonial underdevelopment, as a tool to create a split along religious lines among educated Indians. Hostility towards educated Indians. The emerging middle-class nationalist leadership was analyzing the exploitative, colonial character of British rule and demanding Indian participation in administration. At a time. 554. A brief history of modern India. The nationalist movement was born. Indian National Congress was founded in 1885. The British interpreted the moves as a challenge to their authority and adopted a hostile attitude to such leadership. In fact, from then onwards, they opposed all those who stood for modern education. Attitude towards the zamindars. In their pursuit of reactionary policies and hope to expand their social base, the British looked for alliances with the most reactionary of social groups, the princes, zamindars, etc. The British intended to use them as a counterweight against nationalist-minded intelligentsia. Now, the zamindars and landlords were hailed as the natural and traditional leaders of people. Lands of most of the Awadh talukdars confiscated prior to 1857 were restored to them. The interests and privileges of zamindars and landlords were protected in opposition to those of the peasants. The former in turn saw the British as guarantors of their very existence and became their firm supporters. Attitude towards social reforms. Having decided to side with the reactionary elements of Indian society, the British withdrew support to social reforms, which they felt had aroused the wrath of orthodox sections against them. Also, by encouraging caste and communal consciousness, the British helped the reactionary forces. Underdeveloped social services. A disproportionately large expenditure on army and civil administration, and the cost of wars left little to be spent on social services like education, health, sanitation, physical infrastructure, etc., a legacy which still haunts this country. And whatever facilities were established catered to the elite sections and urban areas. Views. All experience teaches us that where a dominant race rules another, the mildest form of government is despotism. Charles Wood, the Secretary of State for India, systems of nomination, representation, and election were all means of enlisting Indians to work for imperial ends. Annal Seal. Survey of British Policies in India. 555 Labor legislations. As in the early stages of industrial revolution in Europe, the working conditions in factories and plantations in the 19th century India were miserable. Working hours were long, for women and children as well as for men, and wages were low. In overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and poorly lighted working places, the safety measures were practically non-existent. Ironically, the first ever demand for regulation of the condition of workers in factories in India came from the Lancashire textile capitalist lobby. Apprehending the emergence of a competitive rival in the Indian textile industry under conditions of cheap and unregulated labor, they demanded the appointment of a commission for investigation into factory conditions. The first commission was appointed in 1875. Although the first Factory Act was not passed before 1881, the Indian Factory Act, 1881, dealt primarily with the problem of child labor between 7 and 12 years of age. Its significant provisions were: black circle employment of children under 7 years of age prohibited, black circle working hours restricted to 9 hours per day for children, black circle children to get 4 holidays in a month, and black circle hazardous machinery to be properly fenced off. The Indian Factory Act, 1891, black circle increased the minimum age from 7 to 9 years and the maximum from 12 to 14 years. For children, black circle reduced maximum working hours for children to 7 hours a day. Black circle fixed maximum working hours for women at 11 hours per day within 1.5 hour interval. Working hours for men were left unregulated, and black circle provided weekly holiday for all. But these laws did not apply to British-owned tea and coffee plantations, where the labor was exploited ruthlessly and treated like slaves. The government helped these planters by passing laws, such as those which made it virtually impossible for a laborer to refuse to work once a contract was entered into. A breach of contract was a criminal offense, with a planter having the right to get the defaulting laborer arrested. 556. A brief history of modern India. More labor laws were passed under nationalist pressure in the 20th century, but the overall working conditions remained deplorable as ever. Restrictions on freedom of the press. The nationalists had been quick to use new advancements in press technology to educate public opinion and influence government policies through criticism and censure, and latter to arouse national consciousness. In 1835, Metcalfe had lifted restrictions imposed on the Indian press, but Lytton, fearing an increased influence of the nationalist press on public opinion, imposed restrictions in Indian language press through the infamous Vernacular Press Act, 1878. This act had to be repealed under public protest in 1882. After that, the press enjoyed relative freedom for about 2 decades, but was under repression again in the wake of Swadeshi and anti-partition movements. Restrictions were imposed in 1908 and 1910. Also referred to chapter, Development of Press in India. White racism. The notion of white superiority was maintained very carefully by the colonial rulers by systematically excluding the Indians from higher grades of services, both civil and military, from railway compartments, parks, hotels, clubs, etc., and by public display of racial arrogance through beatings, blows, and even murders reported as accidents. As Elgin Onsi wrote, "We could only govern by maintaining the fact that we were the dominant race. Though Indians in service should be encouraged, there is a point at which we must reserve the control to ourselves, if we are to remain at all." Views. I am sorry to hear of the increasing friction between the Hindus and Mohammedans in the Northwest and the Punjab. One hardly knows what to wish, for unity of ideas and action could be very dangerous politically. Divergence of ideas and collision are administratively troublesome. Of the two, the latter is least risky, though it throws anxiety and responsibility upon those on despot where the friction exists. Hamilton, Secretary of State, 1897. The English were an imperial race. We were told, with God-given right to govern us and keep us in subjection. If we protested, we were reminded of the tiger qualities of an imperial race. Jawaharlal Nehru. Survey of British Policies in India. 557 Revenue policies. Agriculture has always been the main occupation of the people in rural India. When the British obtained the Diwanee rights of Bengal in 1765, the agrarian economy was the mainstay of other sectors of the economy as well. The policies of the British changed the agrarian structure as they introduced new systems of land tenures and policies of revenue administration. The main aim was to extract maximum income from land with little care about the interests of the cultivators. Hastings' system. The rapacity and corruption of the employees of the company were partly responsible for one of the worst famines in Bengal in 1769-70. When Warren Hastings became the Governor-General, he adopted the Izardari system, also called the farming system, to bring some order to the revenue collection. The power to collect land revenue was given to contractors, called farmers, chosen on the basis of the highest bids, i.e., those who offered to pay the largest amount from a particular district or subdivision. The land, in other words, was farmed out to the highest bidders. The power of revenue collection was for 5 years at a time, quinquennial settlement. The collection was made annual in 1777. The system resulted in extortion and oppression in the collection of revenue, as the contractors were merely revenue farmers interested in their profit and did not care for the peasants' welfare. And Roman II, the large amounts promised by the contractors far exceeded the production capacity of land. The policy was based on the assumption that the traditional zamindars were mere tax gatherers with no proprietary rights, so the zamindars were even discouraged from bidding. As a result, many hereditary zamindars were ousted. Also, corruption reduced the amount of revenue actually going to the government. The country was impoverished, and as agriculture diminished, so did many items that the British traded in. 558. A brief history of modern India. Silk and cotton, for example. The surplus the British expected from the land revenue did not materialize. Permanent settlement in 1776 itself. Philip Francis, a member of Hastings' council, recommended a permanent settlement in land revenue. In Thind, Lord Cornwallis was sent as Governor-General with instructions that the land revenue settlements with the zamindars be made permanent. Lord Cornwallis set up a committee consisting of himself, Sir John Shore, and James Grant to examine the issue. Cornwallis, himself a member of the landed aristocracy of Britain, favored giving the right of ownership to the zamindars, who, he hoped, would improve the land as English landlords did. Also, the number of cultivators being too large, it was seen to be simpler to collect the revenue from the smaller number of zamindars. So every piece of land in the areas where the permanent settlement was promulgated became a part of some zamindari or other. The permanent settlement or zamindari system covered at around 19% of the territory under British rule. Introduced in Bengal and Bihar, it was extended to Orissa, Banaras, Varanasi, and northern Madras. Features the zamindars were given proprietary rights over their land. In 1790, a 10-year settlement of tax to be paid was made with the zamindars, and in 1793, the settlement was made permanent. A fixed tax on the land had to be paid by the zamindar, and the revenue was to be collected by him from the cultivators who had now become tenants, the ryots or ayats. The zamindar was allowed to keep 1/10 to 1/11 of the revenue and give the rest to the company government. The zamindar, as the owner of the land, could sell, mortgage, or transfer it. His heirs could inherit the land along with rights and liabilities. But, under the sunset clause introduced in 1794, if the tax due was not paid by sunset. Survey of British Policies in India, 559 of a certain date, the zamindari would be taken over by the government and auctioned, and the rights would be transferred to the new owner. Regulations made in 1793, 1799, and 1812 empowered the zamindar to seize the tenant's property if thereint had not been paid, and for this, he did not need the permission of any court of law. Shortcomings, the revenue was fixed at a very high rate, leaving many of the zamindaries with very little or no margin for shortfalls in times of flood, drought, or other calamity. This resulted in the takeover and sale of Manazamindaris in the years following the permanent settlement. Absentee landlordism grew as merchants and government officials, besides other zamindars, bought these lands. The high rates forced many zamindars to divide up their estates into small lots of land called patni taluk and rent them out permanently to holders patnidar, on the promise that they would pay a fixed rent. Thus began the process of subinfeudation. Under the settlement, zamindars were required to issue written agreements, patas, to each cultivator, specifying what tenant was to pay. However, no such agreements were made. The result was that the peasants were at the mercy of the zamindars to be exploited and harassed for more rent, driving the cultivators into the clutch of moneylenders. The peasantry was reduced to serfdom. The zamindars did nothing to improve the land or agricultural system, concentrating only on the extraction of rent. From the government's point of view, there was no way of increasing the tax, so the revenue could not increase to meet the growing expenses of the company, which was trying to expand its base through wars. Riotwary system Thomas Munro and Captain Alexander Reed, who were sent in 1792 to administer the recently acquired Baramahal region off Madras Presidency, devised a system of collecting directly from the villages, fixing the amount that each village had to. 560. A brief history of modern India. When Munro became governor of Madras Presidency in 1820, he introduced the system which came to be known as the riotwary system. The most important reason for the adoption of this system, from the company's point of view, was that it brought in a larger revenue than any other system could have done, as no intermediaries were involved, and whatever was extracted from the cultivator went directly to the government. Munro reduced the tax to 1/3 of the gross produce and extended the riotwary system to other areas in the presidency, excepting those already under permanent settlement. Unfortunately, this 1/3 of gross produce was nearly equal to the economic rental, and the state wanted its money regardless of the actual yield of the holding and the prices prevailing in the market. This continued for nearly 30 years, with the peasants getting deeply mired in poverty. As the system was extended to many districts that had not been surveyed, there was no clear picture of how much land a peasant cultivated, or how much it would produce. Tax was fixed arbitrarily, often on the basis of what the ryot had paid in earlier years. This was known as a putkata assessment. The tax was so high that very often it was beyond the ryot's capacity to pay. But the ryots were coerced and even tortured to extract revenue. Many ryots were forced into the clutch of moneylenders. In 1855, the Madras Torture Commission report revealed the practices of coercion, bribery, and corruption by the subordinate officials of the collectorate. It was from 1855 that a scientific survey of land and a fresh assessment of revenue were undertaken, resulting in a decline in the actual burden of tax. Now it was decided that the revenue rate would be half of the net value of the produce of the land, and the settlement would be made for 30 years. Their formed system of settlement was introduced in 1864, which led to agricultural prosperity and extension of agriculture in coming years, although interrupted by two famines in 1865-66 and 1876-78 in the Bombay Presidency, beginning in Gujarat. The British began collecting directly from the peasants in Survey of British Policies in India, 5,611,813-14. After 1818, when the British conquered the Peshwas territory, the riotwary system on the Madras pattern was also introduced there, under the supervision of Elphinstone, Addisciple of Munro and Governor of Bombay from 1819 to 1827. On the basis of a survey carried out in 1824-28, the state demand was fixed at 55% of the net produce. However, most of the surveys were faulty, and the estimates of produce erroneous, leading to overassessment. The harassment of the peasantry reached such levels that the cultivators deserted their fields and large tracts of land remained fallow. Around 1836, Wingate and Goldsmith improved the system. This modified assessment covered most of the Deccan by 1865. Each field was to be assessed on the basis of its soil and location. The land revenue was somewhat reduced, and land that had become devalued acquired some saleable value. The system was extended to Berar, East Bengal, parts of Assam and Korg. It may be noted that the system was devised at a time when utilitarian ideas had begun to influence policy planning in India, among which was David Ricardo's theory of rent. Features black circle ownership and occupancy rights of land were vested in the riot, and there was no limit on the extent of land they could own. They were free to sublet, transfer, or sell their land. Riots paid the tax directly to the company. Their revenue to be paid was in the range of 45% to 55% based on an estimated production of the land. Revenue was not fixed, so it could be raised when production was higher. The settlement was not permanent and could be revised periodically. In theory, the riot were allowed to cultivate the land off their choice, but in practice, they were more or less forced. They did not want to do so. Barren land under government control was allowed to be cultivated, and the revenue generated would have to be shared with the government. 562. A brief history of modern India. Black circle land could be confiscated if the revenue was not paid. Shortcomings. Black circle overassessment of revenue was a major problem. The land revenue fixed was often more than the capacity of land. The method of collection was inflexible, often involving torture to extract tax. Corruption grew as the officers could be bribed while assessing the land. It was possible for non-cultivating landlords to get registered as the owners of particular holdings, with the actual cultivator being reduced to becoming their tenants, servants, or even bonded laborers. The high tax and the harassment in collection devalued land value, as not many wanted to buy it. Mahilwari system. The adoption of Mahilwari system in parts of northern India began to be considered in 1819 when Holt Mackenzie, the secretary to the Board of Commissioners, recommended this form of the settlement of land revenue. The recommendation was formalized by the Regulation VI of 1922. The complex method of survey, high revenue demand, and harsh methods of extraction led to a breakdown of the scheme. The situation was worsened by the agricultural depression of 1828. Even as arrears began to accumulate, land remained uncultivated, and there were few buyers off land. It was in 1833, when William Bentinck was Governor-General, that the regulation of 1833 simplified the procedure for estimating the produce. Mertens Bird, regarded as the father of land settlements in northern India, supervised the new scheme. It consisted of a survey of attractive land showing field boundaries off cultivated and fallow lands. The state share was fixed at 66% of the rental value, and the settlement was made for 30 years. Even this rate was too high, so Lord Dalhousie issued fresh directions to the settlement officers in 1855, under which the state demand was limited to 50% of their rental value. Survey of British Policies in India, 563. This system came to be known as a modified zamindara system, because the village headman was a link between the individual cultivator and the government. However, he did not have the rights that the zamindar had. It is to be noted that the settlement had different versions and operated with different names at different places. In the northwestern provinces, it went under the name of Mazawar. In the region of the central provinces, its name was Malguzari. The system was a dual system in which settlement was done collectively with the whole community and also with individual landlords. Features black circle mahal, a Hindi word denoting a house or be extension in a state, was the basis of revenue assessment in this system. In the Mahilwari system, a mahal could be village or a group of villages and was considered as the unit for assessment of tax. Revenue was determined on the basis of the produce of a mahal. The village community was considered the owner of land. Individual ownership rights lay with the cultivator. Each individual farmer gave his share of the tax. The responsibility of collection of the tax and payment of that tax to the company government lay with the village headman, called Lambardar, or a community of village leaders. Under Bentinck, the state's revenue share was 66% of the rental value. Later, this was modified to 50%. The concept of average rents for different soil classes was introduced. In the Mahilwari regions, the land revenue was revised periodically. Shortcomings. The system required the government officials to record all the rights of cultivators, zamindars, and others, and fix the tax payable on every piece of land. This was practically impossible to implement. The calculations the officials made were often quite inaccurate, often being based on guesswork, and the collectors. 564. A brief history of modern India usually manipulated them to increase the revenue due to the government. There was scope for corruption too. It hardly favored the village communities. It, in fact, ruined them by imposing exorbitant tax assessments that could not be complied with. In the face of inability of cultivators and landholders to meet the rates of taxation, large tracts of land went to moneylenders and merchants who ousted the old cultivating proprietors or turned them into tenants. On the whole, the settlement system led to impoverishment and large-scale dispossession of the cultivating communities of North India, and their resentment and discontent found expression in the popular uprisings in 1857. From the company point of view, more was spent for the collection than the revenue collected. Overall impact of the British land revenue systems. The Mahilwari settlement was introduced in about 30% of the total area under British rule, i.e., in major parts of the northwestern provinces, central provinces, and the Punjab with some variations. The Ryotwari system covered about 51% of the area under British rule, comprising part of the Bombay and Madras presidencies, Assam, and certain other parts of British India. All these revenue settlements proved disastrous for farmers and zamindars too. As the revenue fixed by the system was too high, many zamindars defaulted on payments and their property was seized. High rates of land revenue indebted the farmers for lifelong. Various types of revenue settlement gave rise to a new form of private ownership of land in which the benefit of the innovation did not reach the cultivators. Instead, it led to the impoverishment of the peasantry and hence rural indebtedness. With zamindar, permanent right on land, the ownership of land became unequal. Land became saleable, mortgageable, and alienable to protect the government's revenue. Survey of British policies in India, 565, the village community was divided into two hostile groups, land-owning class and landless peasantry. The stability and continuity of the Indian village was shaken. The village artisans became jobless and were converted into landless laborers. Under these systems, law courts, lawyers' fees, and formal procedures replaced the old body of customs. The British land revenue systems exposed the Indian peasantry to the exploitations of the moneylenders and the middlemen. The government demand of revenues was arbitrarily high. In such a situation, the landlords delegate the collection of revenue to middlemen who squeezed hysoms from the peasants. The new systems gave rise to absentee landlordism, as the practice of subletting revenue collection rights came in tobing. Exorbitant revenue demands led to commercialization of agriculture. British social and cultural policy in India till 1813. The British followed a policy of non-interference in the social, religious, and cultural life of the country. After 1813, measures were taken to transform Indian society and its cultural environs because of the emergence of new interests and ideas in Britain of the 19th century, in the wake of significant changes in Europe during the 18th and the 19th centuries. Some of these changes were Industrial Revolution, which began in the 18th century and resulted in the growth of industrial capitalism. The rising industrial interests wanted to make India a big market for their goods, and therefore required partial modernization and transformation of Indian society. Roman II, Intellectual Revolution, which gave rise to new attitudes of mind, manners, and morals. Roman III, French Revolution, which with its message of liberty, equality, and fraternity, unleashed the forces of democracy and nationalism. 566. A brief history of modern India. The new trend was represented by Bacon, Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, Adam Smith, and Bentham in thought, and by Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, and Charles Dickens in literature. Characteristics of new thought. Some of the characteristics of the new wave of thought were Rationalism, which advocated faith in reason and a scientific attitude. Roman II, Humanism, which advocated the love of man, the belief that every man is an end in himself and should be respected and prized as such. No man has a right to look upon another man as a mere agent of his happiness. The Sadials gave rise to liberalism, socialism, and individualism. Roman III, Doctrine of progress, according to which nothing is static and all societies must change with time. Man has the capacity to remodel nature and society on just and rational lines. Schools of thought. These new currents of thought caused conflicts among administrators and produced different schools of thought. The conservatives advocated introduction of as few changes as possible. Indian civilization, they felt, was different from the European one but not necessarily inferior to it. Many of these thinkers respected Indian philosophy and culture. If at all, Western ideas and practices were to be introduced gradually and cautiously. Social stability was a must, they felt. Early representatives of this school of thought were Warren Hastings and Edmund Burke, and latter ones included Munro, Metcalfe, and Elphinstone. The conservatives remained influential throughout, and most of British officials in India were generally of a conservative persuasion. The paternalistic imperialists became influential, especially after 1800. They were sharply critical of Indian society and culture, and used to justify economic and political enslavement of India. The radicals went beyond the narrow criticism and imperialistic outlook of the conservatives and the imperialists. Survey of British policies in India, 567, and applied advanced humanistic and rational thought to the Indian situation. They thought that India had the capacity to improve, and that they must help the country do that. They wanted to make India a part of the modern progressive world of science and humanism, and therefore advocated the introduction of modern Western science, philosophy, and literature. Some of the British officials who came to India after 1820 were radicals. They were strongly supported by Raja Ramohan Roy and other like-minded reformers. But predominantly, the ruling elements in the British Indian administration continued to be imperialistic and exploitative. They thought that the modernization of India had to occur within broad limits imposed by the needs of Anasir and more thorough exploitation of its resources. In this respect, often the radicals also towed a conservative line. They desired most of all the safety and perpetuation of the British rule in India. Every other consideration was secondary. Indian Renaissance there were many Indians who instigated social reform and caused legislations to be brought about so as to control and eradicate social evils embedded in so-called tradition. Ramohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, B.M. Malabari, to name a few social reformers, worked hard to get legislation passed by the government to remove social evils. The C-specs have been discussed in detail in the chapter on religious and social reform. Dilemma before the government feared that too much modernization might generate forces hostile to their interests. Thus it was thought it would be appropriate to opt for partial modernization, introducing it in some respects and blocking it in others. In other words, a colonial modernization. Role of Christian missionaries. The missionaries regarded Christianity to be a superior religion and wanted to spread it in India through westernization, which, they believed, would destroy the faith of the natives in their own religion and culture. Towards this end, the Christian missionaries. 568. A brief history of modern India supported the radicals whose scientific approach, they believed, would undermine the native culturine beliefs, supported the imperialists, since law and order and British supremacy were essential for their propaganda, and sought business and the capitalist support, holding out the hope to them that the Christian converts would be better customers of their goods. British retreat. After 1858, however, the policy of hesitant modernization was gradually abandoned. However, the Indians proved to be pupils and shifted rapidly towards modernization of their society and assertion of their culture, and demanded a rule in accordance with the modern principles of liberty, equality, and justice. Now, the British came to side with the socially orthodox and conservative elements of society. They also encouraged casteism and communalism. British policy towards princely states. Relations with princely states were to be guided by a two-point policy, using and perpetuating them as bulwark of empire, and subordinating them completely to British authority, the policy of subordinate union. To cultivate these states as a buffer against future political unrest, and to reward them for their loyalty during the revolt of 1857, the policy of annexation was abandoned. The new policy was to depose or punish but not annex. Also, territorial integrity of states was guaranteed, and it was announced that their right to adopt an heir would be respected. The subordination of princely states to British authority was completed when the fiction of Indian states, standing in a status of equality with the crown as independent, sovereign states ended with the Queen adopting the title of Kaiser-i-Hind, Queen Empress of India, in 1876, to emphasize British sovereignty over entire India. It was later made clear by Lord Curzon that the princes ruled their states merely as agents. Survey of British policies in India, 569 of the British Crown. With paramountcy, the British government exercised the right to interfere in the internal affairs of states through their residents or by appointing and dismissing ministers and officials. The British were helped further in their encroachment by modern developments in communication, railways, roads, telegraph, canals, post offices, etc. The motive for interference was also provided by the rise of nationalist, democratic sentiments in these states, the suppression of which, the British realized, was essential for their survival. As a positive aside to these modern political movements, the British helped these states adopt modern administrative institutions. Also refer to chapter on Indian states under British rule. British foreign policy in India. The pursuance of a foreign policy, guided by interest of British imperialism, often led to India's conflicts with neighboring countries. These conflicts arose due to various reasons. Firstly, political and administrative consolidation of the country, coupled with the introduction of modern means of communication, impelled the government of India to reach out for natural, geographical frontiers for internal cohesion and defense, which sometimes resulted in border clashes. Secondly, the British government had as its major aims, in Africa, protection of the invaluable Indian Empire, Roman II, expansion of British commercial and economic interests, and Roman III, keeping other European imperialist powers, whose colonial interests came in conflict with those of the British, at an arm's length in Asia and Africa. These aims led to British expansion and territorial conquests outside India's natural frontiers, and to conflicts with other imperialist European powers such as Russia and France. View the British and the princes needed one another. India's need for either was highly doubtful. F.G. Hutchins. 570. A brief history of modern India. While the interests served were British, punishment and the bloodshed was Indian. A survey of British relations with various neighbors of India has been made in the chapter, British Expansion and Consolidation in India. Summary. Administrative policies divide and rule hostility to educated Indian zamindars and landlords, propped as counterweights to the nationalists' reversal of policy of support to social reforms. Social services, ignored half-hearted and inadequate labor legislations, introduced stifling of press. Were ever seen to be helping the nationalist upsurge racial arrogance, black circle, revenue policies. Hastings. Efforts permanent settlement riotwary system, Mahalwary system overall impact of British revenue policies, black circle British social and cultural policies, black foreign policy reach, out to natural geographical frontiers, for internal cohesion and defense, keep other European powers at an arm's length promote. British economic and commercial interests. Economic impact of British rule in India. 571,571. Chapter 28. Economic impact of British rule in India. The major difference between the British colonists in India and earlier invaders was that none of the earlier invaders made any structural changes in Indian economy or drained away India's wealth as tribute. British rule in India caused a transformation of India's economy into a colonial economy, i.e., the structure and operation of Indian economy were determined by the interests of the British economy. According to historians, at the beginning of the 18th century, India had some 23% of the world economy. This share came down to some 3% when India got independence. A detailed survey of the economic impact of British rule follows. Deindustrialisation, ruin of artisans and handicraftsmen, one-way free trade cheap and machine-made imports, flooded the Indian market after the Charter Act of 1813, allowing one-way free trade for the British citizens. On the other hand, Indian products found it more and more difficult to penetrate the European markets. Tariffs of nearly 80% were imposed on Indian. 572. A brief history of modern Indiate styles so that Indian cloth could no longer be cheap. After 1820, European markets were virtually closed to Indian exports. Cheap British-made cloth flooded the Indian market. The newly introduced rail network helped the European products to reach the remotest corners of the country. From being a net exporter, India became a net importer. No steps towards modern industrialization, the loss of traditional livelihood, was not accompanied by a process of industrialization in India, as it happened in other rapidly industrializing countries of the time. This resulted in deindustrialization of India at a time when Europe was witnessing a re-intensified industrial revolution. This happened at a time when Indian artisans and handicraftsmen were already feeling the crunch due to loss of patronage by princes and the nobility, who were now under the influence of new Western tastes and values. Ruralization. Another feature of deindustrialization was the decline of many cities and a process of ruralization of India. Many artisans, faced with diminishing returns and repressive policies, in Bengal, during the company's rule, artisans were paid low wages and forced to sell their products at low prices, abandoned their professions, moved to villages, and took to agriculture. This resulted in increased pressure on land. An overburdened agriculture sector was a major cause of poverty during British rule, and this upset the village economic setup. Impoverishment of peasantry. The government, only interested in maximization of rents and in securing its share of revenue, had enforced the permanent views. The misery hardly finds a parallel in the history of commerce. The bones of cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of North India. William Bentinck, the armor of the isolated self-sufficient village, was pierced by the steel rail, and its life-blood ebbed away. D.H. Buchanan. Economic impact of British rule in India. 573. Settlement system, in large parts. Transferability of land was one feature of the new settlement, which caused great insecurity to the tenants, who lost all their traditional rights in land. There was little spending by the government on improvement of land productivity. The zamindars, with increased powers, resorted to summary evictions, demanded illegal dues and bigar to maximize their share in the produce, and as such, had no incentive to invest for the improvement of agriculture. The overburdened peasants had to approach the moneylenders to be able to pay their dues to the zamindars. The moneylender, who was often also the village grain merchant, forced the farmer to sell the produce at low prices to clear his dues. The powerful moneylender was also able to manipulate the judiciary and law in his favor. The peasant turned out to be the ultimate sufferer under the triple burden of the government, zamindar, and moneylender. His hardship increased at the time of famine and scarcity. This was as much true for the zamindari areas as for areas under riotwary and mahalwary systems. The peasant became landless. Emergence of intermediaries, absentee landlordism, ruin of old zamindars. By 1815, half of the total land in Bengal had passed into new hands. Merchants, moneylenders, and other moneyed view for most of the colonial era. The story of India manufacturing was of dispossession, displacement, and defeat. What happened to India's textiles was replicated across the board. From the great manufacturing nation described by Sunderland, India became a mere exporter of raw materials and foodstuffs, raw cotton, as well as jute, silk, coal, opium, rice, spices, and tea. With the collapse of its manufacturing and the elimination of manufactured goods from its export rosters, India's share of world manufacturing exports fell from 27% to 2% under British rule. Shashi Tharoor in an era of darkness. 574. A brief history of modern India. Classes living in towns. The new zamindars, with increased powers but with little or no avenues for new investments, resorted to land grabbing and subinfeudation. increase a number of intermediaries to be paid, gave rise to absentee landlordism, and increased the burden on the peasant. Since the demand for land was high, prices went up, and so did the abilities of the peasant. With no traditional or benevolences with the tenants, the zamindar had no incentive to invest in the improvement of agriculture. The interests of the zamindars lay only in the perpetuation of British rule and in opposing the national movement. Stagnation and deterioration of agriculture. The cultivator had neither the means nor any incentive to invest in agriculture. The zamindar had no roots in the villages, while the government spent little on agricultural, technical, or mass education. All this, together with fragmentation of land due to subinfeudation, made it difficult to introduce modern technology, which caused a perpetually low level of productivity. Famine and poverty. Regular recurrence of famines became a common feature of daily existence in India. These famines were not just because of food grain scarcity, but were a direct result of poverty unleashed by colonial forces in India. Between 1850 and 1900, about 2.8 crore people died in famines. Commercialization of Indian agriculture in the latter half of the 19th century. Another significant trend was the emergence of the commercialization of agriculture. So far, agriculture had been a way of life rather than a business enterprise. Now agriculture began to be influenced by commercial considerations. Certain specialized crops began to be grown not for consumption in the village but for sale in the national and even international markets. Commercial crops like cotton, jute, groundnut, oilseeds. Economic impact of British rule in India, 575 sugarcane, tobacco, etc., were more remunerative than food grains. Again, the cultivation of crops like condiments, spices, fruits, and vegetables could cater to a wider market. Perhaps, the commercialization trend reached the highest level of development in the plantation sector, i.e., in tea, coffee, rubber, indigo, etc., which was mostly owned by Europeans, and the produce was for sale in a wider market. The new market trend of commercialization and specialization was encouraged by many factors: spread off money economy, replacement of custom and tradition by competition and contract, emergence of a unified national market, growth of internal trade, improvement in communications through rail and roads, and boost to international trade given by entry of British finance capital, etc. For the Indian peasant, commercialization seemed a forced process. There was hardly any surplus for him to invest in commercial crops, given the subsistence level at which he lived, while commercialization linked Indian agriculture with international market trends and their fluctuations. For instance, the cotton of the 1860s pushed up prices, but this mostly benefited the intermediaries, and when the slump in prices came in 1866, it hit the cultivators the most, bringing in its turn heavy indebtedness, famine, and agrarian riots in the Deccan in the 1870s. Thus, the cultivator hardly emerged better from the new commercialization trend. Destruction of industry and late development of modern industry. Indian industry was steadily destroyed. The destruction of textile competition of India is a glaring example of the deview. The servants of the company forced the natives to buy dear and sell cheap. Enormous fortunes were thus rapidly accumulated at Calcutta, while 30 millions of human beings were reduced to the extremity of wretchedness. They had never had to live under tyranny like this. Macaulay. 576. A brief history of modern deindustrialisation of India. The British stopped paying for Indian textiles in pounds, choosing instead to pay from their revenue gained from Bengal, and at very low rates, thus impoverishing the peasants further. A thriving shipbuilding industry was crushed. Surat and Malabar on the western coast, and Bengal and Masuliputtnam on the eastern coast were known for their shipbuilding industries. The British ships contracted by the company were given a monopoly over trade routes, while even the Indian merchant ships plying along the coast were made to face heavy duties. In 1813, a law by the British Parliament prohibited ships below 350 tons from sailing between India to Britain. This effectively put a large proportion of Bengal-built ships out of commission on the Indo-British trade routes. In 1814, another law was passed under which Indian-built ships were refused to be considered British registered vessels, which could trade with America and the European continent. So, the decline of the Indian shipping industry wasendered. The British did not allow the Indian steel industry to grow. Industries like the Tatas, which began to produce steel after a lot of trouble getting the required permissions, were restricted by being forced to produce a higher standard of steel for British use. The firms were not able to produce a lower standard of steel at the same time, so they were left out of the larger market that demanded the lower quality of steel. As restrictions were placed by Britain on Indian steel imports, this steel could only be used in India. Obviously, the growth of the industry was hampered. Indian traders, moneylenders, and bankers had amassed some wealth as junior partners of English merchant capitalists in India. Their role fitted in the British scheme of colonial exploitation. The Indian moneylender provided loans to hard-pressed agriculturists and thus facilitated the state collection of revenue. The Indian trader carried imported British products to the remotest corners and helped in the movement of Indian agricultural products for exports. The indigenous bankers helped both in the process of distribution and collection. But the colonial situation retarded the development of a healthy and independent industrial. Economic impact of British rule in India, 577 bourgeoisie, and its development was different from other independent countries like Germany and Japan. It was only in the second half of the 19th century that modern machine-based industries started coming up in India. The first cotton textile mill was set up in 1853 in Bombay Kawasji Nanapoi, and the first jute mill came up in 1855 in Rishra, Bengal. But most of the modern industries were foreign-owned and controlled by British managing agencies. There was a rush of foreign capital in India at this time due to prospects of high profits, availability of cheap labor, cheap and readily available raw material, ready market in India on the neighbors, diminishing avenues for investments at home, willingness of the administration to provide all help, and ready markets abroad for some Indian exports such as stia, jute, and manganese. Indian-owned industries came up in cotton textiles and jute in the 19th century, and in sugar, cement, etc. in the 20th century. Indian-owned industries suffered from money handicaps, credit problems, no tariff protection by government, unequal competition from foreign companies, and stiff opposition from British capitalist interests who were backed by sound financial and technical infrastructure at home. The colonial factor also caused certain structural and institutional changes. The industrial development was characterized by a lopsided pattern. Core and heavy industrial sand power generation were neglected, and some regions were favored more than the others, causing regional disparities. These regional disparities hampered the process of nation building. In the absence of careful nurturing of technical view, deindustrialisation was a deliberate British policy, not an accident. British industry flourished, and Indian industry did not because of systematic destruction, abetted by tariffs and regulatory measures that stacked the decks in favor of British industry conquering the Indian market, rather than the other way around. Shashi Tharoor in an Era of Darkness. 578. A Brief History of Modern India. Economic drain. The term, economic drain, refers to a portion of national product of India which was not available for consumption of its peoples, but was being drained away to Britain for political reasons, and India was not getting adequate economic or material returns for it. The drain theory was put forward by Dadabhai Naoroji in his book Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. The major components of this drain were salaries and pensions of civil and military officials, interests and loans taken by the Indian government from abroad, profits on foreign investment in India, stores purchased in Britain for civil and military departments, payments to be made for shipping, banking, and insurance services which stunted the growth of Indian enterprise in these services. The drain of wealth checked and retarded capital formation in India, while the same portion of wealth accelerated the growth of British economy. The surplus from British economy re-entered India's finance capital, further draining India of its wealth. This had immense effect on income and employment potential within India education. The industry lacked sufficient technical manpower. Socially, the rise of an industrial capitalist class and working class was an important feature of this phase. Nationalist critique of colonial economy. The early intellectuals of the first half of the 19th century supported British rule, under the impression that it would modernize the country based on latest technology and capitalist economic organization. After the 1860s, disillusionment started to set in among the politically conscious and they began to probe into the reality of British rule in India. The foremost among these economic analysts was Dadabhai Naoroji, the grand old man of India, who after a brilliant analysis of the colonial economy put forward the theory of economic drain in poverty and un-British rule in India. Other economic analysts included Justice Mahadev Govind Ranade, Romesh Chandra Dutt, The Economic History. Economic impact of British rule in India, 579 of India, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, G. Subramania Iyer, and Prithwish Chandra Ray. The essence of 19th century colonialism, they said, lay in the transformation of India into a supplier of foodstuffs and raw materials to the metropolis, a market for metropolitan manufacturers, and a field for investment of British capital. These early nationalist analysts organized intellectual agitations and advocated a complete severance of India's economic subservience to Britain and the development of an independent economy based on modern industries. British policies making India poor. The basic assertion of these early intellectuals was that India was poor and growing poorer due to British imperialism, and since the causes of India's economic backwardness were man-made, they were explainable and removable. The problem of poverty was seen as a problem of raising productive capacity and energy of the people, or as a problem of national development, thus making poverty a national issue. This helped in rallying all sections of society around common economic issues. Also, development was equated with industrialization. This industrialization was to be based on Indian and not foreign capital, because, according to the early nationalists, foreign capital replaced and suppressed instead of augmenting and encouraging Indian capital. This suppression caused economic drain, further strengthening British hold over India. The political consequences of foreign capital investments were equally harmful, as they caused political subjugation and created vested interests, which sought security for investors, thus perpetuating the foreign rule. Growth of trade and railways. To help Britain, these analysts expose the force of British arguments that growth of foreign trade and railways implied development for India. They pointed out that the pattern of foreign trade was unfavorable to India. It relegated India to a position of importer of finished goods and exporter of raw materials and foodstuffs. The development of railways, they argued, was not coordinated with India's industrial needs, and it ushered in a commercial rather than an industrial revolution. The net. 580, A Brief History of Modern India views India Reform Tract, II, p. 3, says, "It is an exhausting drain upon the resources of the country, the issue of which is replaced by no reflex. It is an extraction of the lifeblood from the veins of national industry, which no subsequent introduction of nourishment is furnished to restore. Data by Neoroji, quoting from Mill's History of India, our system acts very much like a sponge, drawing up all the good things from the banks of the Ganges and squeezing them down on the banks of the Thames." John Sullivan, President, Board of Revenue, Madras, where foreign capital has been sunk in a country. The administration of that country becomes at once the concern of the bondholders. The Hindu, September 1889. It is not the pitiless operations of economic laws, but it is the thoughtless and pitiless action of the British policy. It is the pitiless eating of India's substance in India, and the further pitiless drain to England. In short, it is the pitiless perversion of economic laws by the sad bleeding to which India is subjected, that is destroying India. Data by Neoroji. Taxes spent in the country from which they are raised are totally different in their effect from taxes raised in one country and spent in another. In the former case, the taxes collected from the population are again returned to the industrious classes, but the case is wholly different when the taxes are not spent in the country from which they are raised. They constitute an absolute loss and extinction of the whole amount withdrawn from the taxed country. The money might as well be thrown into the sea. Such is the nature of the tribute we have so long exacted from India. Sir George Wingate, under the native despot the people keep and enjoy what they produce, though at times they suffer some violence. Under the British Indian despot, the man is at peace. There is no violence. His substance is drained away, unseen, peaceably and subtly. He starves in peace and peaceably perishes in peace with law and order. Data by Neoroji. Economic impact of British rule in India. 581 Effect of the railways was to enable foreign goods to outsell indigenous products. Further, the benefits from impetus to steel, machinery, and capital investment in railways accrued to the British. G.V. Joshi remarked, "Expenditure on railways should be seen as an Indian subsidy to British industries." One-way free trade and tariff policy. The nationalists claimed that one-way free trade was ruining the Indian handicrafts industry, exposing it to premature, unequal, and unfair competition, while tariff policy was guided by British capitalist interests. On the finance front, taxes were levied to overburden the poor, sparing British capitalists and the bureaucrats. They demanded reduction of land revenue, abolition of salt tax, imposition of income tax, and excise duties on consumer goods consumed by the rich middle classes. The government expenditure, it was argued, was meant to serve colonial needs only, while development and welfare were ignored. Effect of economic drain. The drain theory incorporated all threads of the nationalist critique that it denuded India of its productive capital. According to nationalist estimates, the economic drain at that time was black circle more than the total land revenue, or views. There can be no denial that there was a substantial outflow which lasted for 190 years. If these funds had been invested in indiathy, could have made a significant contribution to raising income levels. Angus Madison. Taxation raised by the king, says the Indian poet, is like the moisture sucked up by the sun, to be returned to the earth as fertilizing rain. But the moisture raised from the Indian soil no descends as fertilizing rain largely on other lands, not on India. R.C. Dut trade cannot thrive without efficient administration, while theater is not worth attending to in the absence of profits of the former. So, always with the assent and often to the dictates of the Chamber of Commerce, the government of India is carried in, and this is the white man's burden. Sachidanand Sinha. 582. A Brief History of Modern India. Black circle, half the total government revenue, or black circle, 1/3 of the total savings. In today's terms, it amounted to 8% of the national product. The concept of drain, one country taking away wealth from another country, was easily grasped by a nation of peasants for whom exploitation was a matter of daily experience. Economic issue, a stimulant to national unrest. The nationalist agitation on economic issues served to undermine the ideological hegemony of alien rulers over Indian minds, that the foreign rule was in the interest of Indians, thus exposing the myth of its moral foundations. It was also shown clearly that India was poor because it was being ruled for British interests. This agitation was one of the stimulants for intellectual unrest and spread of national consciousness during the moderate phase of freedom struggle, 1875–1905. the seed time of national movement. Till the end of the 19th century, the nationalists had been demanding some share in political power and control over the purse. During the first decade of the 20th century, they started demanding self-rule, like the United Kingdom or the colonies, and prominent among such nationalists was Dadabhai Naoroji. Stages of colonialism in India. The fundamental character of British rule in India did not remain the same through its long history of nearly 2 centuries. The changing pattern of Britain's position in the world economy led to changes in the nature of British colonialism. Marxist historians, especially Rajni Palmi Dutt, identified 3 overlapping stages in the history of imperialist rule in India. He points out that each stage developed out of the conditions of the previous stage, and the different modes of colonial exploitation overlapped. Old forms of colonial exploitation never entirely ceased, but got integrated into new patterns of exploitation. These stages are, however, economic impact of British rule in India. 583 marked by distinct dominant features, i.e., qualitative change from one stage to another. First stage, the period of merchant capital, mercantilism, often described as the period of monopoly trade and direct appropriation, or the period of East India Company's domination, 1757-1813, was based on 2 basic objectives. To acquire a monopoly of trade with India, against other English or European merchants or trading companies, as well as against the Indian merchants. Roman 2, to directly appropriate or take over governmental revenues through control over state power. During this period, no basic changes were introduced in administration, judicial system, transport and communication, methods of agricultural or industrial production, forms of business management or economic organization. Nor were any major changes made in education or intellectual field, culture or social organization. In fact, the traditional Indian civilization, religions, laws, caste system, family structure, etc., were not seen as obstacles in the colonial exploitation. The only changes made were in military organization and technology, which native rulers were also introducing in their armed forces, and Roman 2 in administration at the top of the structure of revenue collection, so that it could become more efficient and smooth. In this phase, there was large-scale drain of wealth from India, which constituted 2–3% of Britain's national income at the time. It was this wealth that played an important role in financing Britain's industrial revolution. In this stage, there was no large-scale import of British manufactures into India. Rather, the reverse occurred. There was an increase in export of Indian textiles, etc. The weavers were, however, ruined at this stage by the company's monopoly and exploitation. They were forced to produce for the company under uneconomic compulsions. 584, a brief history of modern India. Second stage, owing to its mode of exploitation being trade. This stage is also termed as colonialism of free trade. It started with the Charter Act of 1813 and continued till 1860s. Soon after the East India Company became the ruler over most parts of India, there was a debate in Britain as to whose interests newly acquired colony would serve. The newly emerging industrial capitalists began to criticize the East India Company and its exploitation of India. They demanded that colonial administration and policy in India should now serve British capitalist interests, which were very different from those of the East India Company. Now India was to serve as a market for the ever-increasing output of British manufactured goods, especially textiles. At the same time, the new capitalists in England needed from India exports of raw materials, especially cotton and food grains. Moreover, India could buy more British goods only if it earned foreign exchange by enhancing its exports. The export of raw materials was increased sharply to meet the dividends of the company and profits of British merchants. Besides, there was a need of money to pay for pensions of British officials who would go to Britain after retirement. In this phase, the following dominant features were visible. India's colonial economy was integrated with the British and the world capitalist economy. This was made possible with the introduction of free trade. All import duties in India were either totally removed or drastically reduced to nominal rates. Roman 2. Free entry was also granted to the British capitalists to develop tea, coffee, and indigo plantations, trade, transport, mining, and modern industries in India. The British Indian government gave active state help to such capitalists. Roman 3. The permanent settlement and the riotwary system in agriculture were introduced to transform traditional agrarian structure into a capitalist one. Roman 4. Administration was made more comprehensive and included villages and outlying areas of the country. The changes were brought about to make British goods reach and economic impact of British rule in India. 585 agricultural products drawn from interior villages and remote parts. Personal law was largely left untouched since it did not affect colonial transformation of the economy. However, the changes related to criminal law, law of contract, and legal procedures were overhauled to promote capitalist commercial relations and maintain law and order. Roman 6. Modern education was introduced to provide cheap manpower to the vastly expanded administration. However, it was also aimed at transforming India's society and culture for two reasons. A, create an overall atmosphere of change and development, and B, give birth to a culture of loyalty to the rulers. Roman 7. The taxation and the burden on peasants rose sharply due to economic transformation and costly administration, civil as well as military. Roman 8. India absorbed 10 to 12% of British exports and nearly 20% of Britain's textile exports. After 1850, engine coaches, rail lines, and other railway stores were imported into India at a large scale. Roman 9. The Indian Army was used for British expansion of colonialism in Asia and Africa. Third stage. The third stage is often described as the era of foreign investments and international competition for colonies. It began around the 1860s in India, owing to several changes in the world economy. These changes were as follows. I. Britain's industrial supremacy was challenged by several countries of Europe, the United States, and Japan. Roman 2. As a result of the application of scientific knowledge to industry, the pace of industrialization increased sharply. Use of petroleum as fuel for the internal combustion engineered the use of electricity for industrial purposes were significant innovations. Roman 3. The world market became more unified due to revolution in the means of international transport. During this stage, Britain made strenuous efforts to consolidate its control over India. Liberal imperialist policies get replaced with reactionary imperialist policies, which were reflected in the viceroyalties of Lytton, Dufferin, Lansdowne. 586. A brief history of modern India and Curzon. The strengthening of colonial rule over India was meant to keep out the rivals as well as to attract British capital to India and provide it security. As a result, a very large amount of British capital got invested in railways, loans, to the government of India, trade, and to a lesser extent, in plantations, coal mining, jute mills, shipping, and banking in India. The notion of training the Indian people for self-government vanished, revived only after 1918 because of the pressure exerted by the Indian national movement. Now, theme of British rule was declared as permanent trusteeship over the Indians. The Indians were declared to be permanently immature, a child people needing British control and trusteeship. Geography, climate, race, history, religion, culture, and social organization were all cited as factors in making the Indians unfit for self-government or democracy. The British thus tried to justify their rule over Indians for centuries to come, all in the name of civilizing a barbaric people, the white man's burden. Summary. Black economic impact of British rule. Deindustrialisation. Ruin of artisans and handicraftsmen. Impoverishment of peasantry. Ruralization of India. Emergence of new land relations. Ruin of old zamindar. Stagnation and deterioration of agriculture. Commercialization of Indian agriculture. Development of modern industry. Rise of Indian national bourgeoisie. Economic drain. Famine and poverty. Black nationalist critique. India getting poorer due to colonial exploitation. Problem of poverty. A national problem of raising productivity capacities and energy development equated with industrialization, which should take place through Indian, not foreign capital. British policies on trade, finance, infrastructure development, expenditure designed to serve imperialist interests. Need for complete severance of India's economic subserviency to Britain and development of an independent economy.